I have such a complicated relationship with this book. Became the writer that we know and love, but lawyers lie like maggots in nuts. Charles Dickens, 1853. I finished Bleak House. I'm finally ready to talk about it. I have such a complicated relationship with this book. I think I've mentioned it in several videos now. Essentially, it took me 4 years to finish this book. I first officially started it in 2022. It was summer, put it down, wasn't reading it anymore. I picked it back up 2023 going into 2024. I tend to pick it up December and then take it into January. Ended up needing to retake the bar exam, and I don't think doing that while reading this book was possible, which is crazy because I read Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky the first time that I was studying for it, and I loved it. I adored that novel. I'll get into it a little bit. I want this video to be primarily about Bleak House, not Dostoevsky. I'm gonna keep the focus there. I had to put it down. I essentially made it to the point that I had made it the last time before putting it down again. I made it a little bit further maybe. The first reading experience to the second reading experience was very, very different. I will say the first time that I picked it up, I was enjoying this novel and having a fun time with it. And the second time I picked it up, it is horror, pure horror. I think this novel is primarily a horror story, honestly. And it's really scary that it's been 200 years and a lot of this still rings true and still holds true. So final time, third time, I've finished it. Will I ever reread this book? Who knows? The third time's a charm. I finished it. I started where I left off because I found myself keep thinking about this. I really did remember it. My second read, I found that I really did remember it. Towards the end, there was one plot point I had forgotten, and that sort of kind of came back, and it wasn't a big deal. It was just kind of funny. I picked this up end of 2025 into this year, 2026. So I finished it in about 2 months, the last 700 or so pages that I had to read. And I found myself really liking it. I will say the experience of reading this book was not enjoyable. It is not an enjoyable book to read. That's just a personal experience, but it's one of those books that I'm glad that I've read, and having read the whole thing. I ended up giving this 4 stars. That is purely from an analytical and Dickens critique of the law perspective. That's not, again, enjoyability of this book, and this is not a book I would recommend for everyone. Before I dive in to the points in this book that I wanted to talk about and my favorite parts of this novel, there's so much in here, but there's really 3 things that I wanted to explore in greater depth that if I was in an English class, I would be writing an essay about this. This is what I would want to be talking about. This isn't a compare and contrast video about Dickens and Dostoevsky, but Dostoevsky, the Brothers Karamazov, and a lot of his other works are also about law and the legal system. Tolstoy wrote Resurrection, and he deals with the law in his other works. A lot of these major, primarily male, because women couldn't be attorneys, couldn't be in the law, primarily male authors, a lot of them did have a legal background and a background in law, and a lot of them wrote these very epic stories about law. And at least with Dostoevsky, a lot of that is tied into religion too, Christian religion, which is also very interesting. I don't feel like Dickens gets into it in this novel, but at least British law, it was tied to the king, and the king was ordained by God. So the legal system is very much wrapped up and tied up in Christianity, at least in a Western sense. So back to my very brief Dickens and Dostoevsky comparison. I feel like Dostoevsky approaches law from a philosophical perspective. Everything in his work is philosophical. Everything is symbolic. everything has a deeper meaning. And I really, really love that in literature. It's not for everyone, but I do really love that. Dickens is more on your face, and he is very good at caricature, creating caricature, making fun of people, and I think his critique is primarily through satire. So if you're looking to tackle some of these big novels about law and justice, keep that in mind when you're picking maybe the author that you want to go into. But I do think that Dickens is very good at satire. I've written down 3 points that I want to get into in this video, and I'll break them down briefly right now. The first one is Miss Flite's birds. Throughout my reading of this book, there is a character, her name is Miss Flite. Her role is she continuously goes to court and she is waiting for a verdict to be rendered in this famous case, Jarndyce v. Jarndyce. Hello, Miss Olive. You want to say hi? She likes the ribbon. Miss Flite is a staple in the courtroom, and when we first meet her, we learn about her birds. She keeps these birds, and she explains the meaning of that to Richard and Ada. The second point that I want to talk about Crook and some of Dickens' commentary on the legal profession in general. Crook is a character. He can't read, he can't write, he owns a rags and bottle shop, but he's also called the Lord Chancellor. Then the final point that I want to tie into is how law ties into this idea of empire and really focus on the character of Caddy. Starting strong with the birds and Miss Flite. The birds really represent this idea of justice that is better as an idealized form than it works out in practice. It shows how these various characters are trapped and can be trapped by the wheels of justice. And it shows that law and justice aren't necessarily linked. They do not equal liberty. This is a very important theme and motif that recurs throughout the novel. The penguin cloth-bound cover is actually cages, and these represent the cages that Miss Flite keeps her birds in. So we have Miss Flite's birds, and then we have the 3 different birds that we meet in this case. First, we have Mr. Jarndyce. He is the benefactor. He takes in Esther, Richard, and Ada, and he acts as their guardian. He is their guide. He's guiding them through this case. He's been involved in this chancery suit since its inception, essentially, and up till this point, Richard and Ada have been shielded from it. And there is, of course, Richard and Ada themselves, and they are the next generation that's now coming into this chancery suit that still has not been resolved. Each of them has different ways with coping with the legal system. Mr. Jarndyce's coping mechanism is avoidance. This is a quote more towards the end, but Mr. Jarndyce does throughout the novel say various matters, and he's encouraging Richard to find a profession and keep this suit in the back of the mind, not let it become his whole life, not let it take over his life. Unfortunately, as we'll see when we get to Richard, that doesn't become the case, but he really does try. And I think this quote at the end of the novel captures his views towards the case, his embodiment of this case. He is talking to Esther. Esther is sort of the housekeeper, the housemaid. I'm honestly not really getting into her story in this video, but she is a huge part of the novel. She's one of the novel's core main characters, and there's a whole other storyline with her. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out the book. He's talking to Esther about the case. What shall we find reasonable in Jarndyce and Jarndyce? Unreason and injustice at the top, unreason and injustice at the heart and at the bottom, unreason and injustice from beginning to end, if it ever has an end. Mr. Jarndyce is disillusioned with this legal system, and you can't really blame him. He has been following this case. It's been going on for years and years. There's never been any progress. And now he's looking to the next generation because they're now coming of age. They're no longer minors, and they're going to need some guidance. And he realizes even if there is this judgment, it's not going to benefit him. His reaction, his reception to having been involved in this case, knowing how it goes, knowing how it works, is to avoid it, to ignore it. He doesn't go to court. He doesn't follow the case anymore. He has an attorney. He says, you deal with this. I don't want to deal with this. I don't think that his reaction is necessarily the right reaction. I don't think Dickens is arguing that it is the right reaction. So he is maybe the anarchy character, maybe the anti-law. We don't want law. We don't need law. And I think Dickens is clearly arguing that that's not an option. That's not a great response to this. You can't just bury your head in the sand and completely ignore these issues. That doesn't really work. Next, we get into Richard. Richard is one of Mr. Jarndyce's wards. He's one of the cousins in the case. I'm not quite sure of the family tree, not quite sure how all these people are related. Richard and Ada are cousins, and Mr. Jarndyce is like an older cousin, a little bit removed. Mr. Jarndyce is helping Richard pick a profession. And throughout the book, we see him in this state of confusion, this state of turmoil. He's trying to figure out who he is and what he wants to do. He thinks, maybe I'll go into law, maybe I'll go into the army, maybe I'll go into the Navy. And eventually he gets in financial trouble. He's in this debt and he returns to the law, and finally, ultimately, he gives in and he becomes obsessed and so involved in this case. Getting more involved in this case, he becomes more involved with Miss Flite and he starts attending court with her. But he never thought, never, my poor dear sanguine Richard, capable of so much happiness then, and with such better things before him, what a fatal link was riveting between his fresh youth and her faded age. That is referring to Miss Flite. Between his free hopes and her caged birds, and her hungry garret and her wandering mind. So we really start seeing him getting sucked into this case. It starts consuming him. And unfortunately, if you don't want this spoiled, skip this next part. Unfortunately, it does consume him. Richard ultimately dies. The suit ends. It isn't resolved, but it ends. And at its end, so too does Richard end. It's without the suit, he can't survive. Then the third character, and I do have a little bit of beef with Dickens and how he writes female characters, so I really don't think there's much on her, but Ada is the third character. So we have Mr. Jarndyce. He represents the complete avoidance approach to the law. We have Richard, who represents the all-consuming approach to the law. And then we have Ada, who is very closely tied to Richard and ultimately ends up marrying him. She represents a loved one who is supporting someone who is consumed by the law. Ada really becomes roped into this suit. So that quote about Miss Flite and the fresh youth and the caged birds. After that, several hundred pages, Mr. Jarndyce is talking to Ada and he says, "Ada, my bird." And that to me was just heartbreaking. And after that, we get Miss Flite's naming of the birds. So Miss Flite, she literally keeps these little canaries in cages, and her plan is to release them once the suit is resolved. They have various different names, and later in the novel, she replaces them and they get some new names. And very early on in the novel, she says, "How sad to think these canaries are new. They're quite young, but they will never know freedom because this case is going on for so long." So she gets more birds. 2 more. I call them the wards in Jarndyce. They're caged up with all the others, with hope, joy, youth, peace, rest, life, dust, ashes, waste, want, ruin, despair, madness, death, cunning, folly, words, wigs, rags, sheepskin, plunder, precedent, jargon, gammon, and spinach. The list is a little bit comical, but within that list you have things like hope, joy, youth. So much gets tied up, so much gets lost in this case. But we also have wigs and rags. We have spinach, which is just a little bit of nonsense. Ultimately, the suit is wrapped up, and as I mentioned, Richard dies. So Miss Fleet, true to her promise, when all was still at a late hour, poor crazed Miss Fleet came weeping to me and told me that she had given her birds their liberty. What does Dickens have to say about the law through these three characters? We have Mr. Jarndyce, Richard, Ada. I don't think he necessarily comes to an answer, or a good answer, or a clear answer. The answer clearly is not to be avoidant, as Mr. Jarndyce is, because in his avoidance he really ends up not being able to help his wards, and he can't help his wards navigate it as he should. He's not making the system better by refusing to be a part of it. With Richard, we see how being an active participant to the point of obsession consumes you, and how that is incredibly harmful as well. Then through Ada, we see the damage it does to those who get unwittingly caught up in it through their connections, relationships, and really their loved ones. I think through these three characters and through the birds, Dickens really has a compelling and complete critique of the legal system in Britain at that time. He doesn't propose or reach any solutions, but he really shows how damaging a case like this can be. Switching gears to point number 2, and I think this ties in a little bit to Richard. Next, I want to talk about Crook. Crook is the owner of the rags and bottle shop near the Chancery Court and Chancery Lane. He cannot read or write, but he is teaching himself to read and write, and he's not copying any of the letters correctly. So, you know, when you're in kindergarten, first grade, they teach you how to write letters and the way to draw them. So Crook is teaching himself how to draw them, but he's just copying it based on how the symbol works and not getting the brush strokes right necessarily. He's very interested and very invested in these legal matters, and he's squirreling away all these little items that he thinks may or may not be important. And he ends up with some quite important papers that he can't understand, and he's trying to make sense of them. He's trying to piece together. This is quite a famous part of the novel, and I haven't looked into any of it, and many scholars have. I'm sure you can find some things online about it. This is really the part that drew me back into the novel, and I think when it starts to get interesting, so take that for what it's worth. It took me about 500 pages to get into this book. The Lord Chancellor of that court, true to his title in his last act, has died the death of all Lord Chancellors in all courts and of all authorities in all places, under all names soever, where false pretenses are made, and where injustice is done. Call the death by any name your highness will, attribute it to whom you will, or say it might have been prevented how you will. It is the death eternally, inborn, inbred, engendered in the corrupted humors of the vicious body itself, and that only spontaneous combustion, and none other of all the deaths that can be died. Like I mentioned earlier, the British legal system is tied to the king, which in effect means that it's tied to God. I think that through Crook, he labels him the Lord Chancellor, this uneducated man. I think that he can criticize the judges and the legal system without coming right out and criticizing the legal system. He talks about the inborn, inbred, and engendered, the problems with this legal system that have perpetuated. And whoa, big stretch. Come here, kid. And then the corrupted humors of the vicious body. So back in Dickens' time, people thought that illnesses were governed by humors. So if you were a little melancholy or depressed, it would mean that your bile was off. So there were 4 humors of the body, and that determined your well-being. He is saying that the only end to this system is this explosion, this complete consumption. And like Richard, Crook, who's trying to figure this out, who is a participant in this system, he gets consumed by it. My third and last point, very briefly, is Caddy. I really liked the character of Caddy, and I liked the dynamic of her family and the contrast between Caddy and her mother. Very early on, we find Caddy in a state of ink. I loved that phrase. I love how we kept finding her. She is her mother's scribe slash secretary. Her mom learns about these problems in Africa and people there who are really suffering and need a lot of help. And she is constantly employed in writing letters, forming societies, creating petitions to get them this help. There's a great line early on in the novel, and it's talking about Mrs. Jellyby. That's the last name, Caddy's last name. Mrs. Jellyby cannot see anything closer than Bora Bora. I think it is. And the critique is her family lives in squalor. Caddy has several siblings. One of them is little Pee-Pee, and they really live in quite a devastating state. And Caddy cares for them as best she can, but she's also her mother's secretary, and she's busy working and creating all these documents. Caddy really doesn't get the love from her mother that she needs, and there's a question of how much good that Mrs. Jellyby is actually doing. I feel like this ties into the idea of empire and the British Empire's expansion at that time, whether or not they're actually helping these other countries by imposing their beliefs and imposing their systems upon them, and the legal system is a part of that system. Towards the end of the novel, we get a clearer link between empire and the legal system. I believe this is Mr. Jarndyce's attorney, Kenj. So Kenj says to Mr. Jarndyce towards the end, "Prejudice, prejudice. My dear sir, this is a very great country, a very great country. Its system of equity is a very great system, a very great system, really, really." And then on the next page, "We are a great country, Mr. Jarndyce. We are a very great country. This is a great system, Mr. Jarndyce. And would you wish a great country to have a little system? Now really, really." He said this at the stairhead, gently moving his right hand as if it were a silver trowel with which to spread the cement of his words on the structure of the system and consolidate it for 1,000 ages. There's so much pride here for this country and this system, and it feels like almost a lot of it is for show. A lot of it is very procedural and very traditional. This quote is a little bit two-faced. It's a little bit of a critique because it's saying this country is so great and this legal system needs to be big and so grand because it needs to show and reflect our greatness. Maybe that part isn't necessarily true, but there is something important to be said about continuity. He says for 1,000 ages, and that's part of why they have these systems and these traditions. It's a sense of continuity, a sense of certainty. However, it can become a problem when it's no longer certainty, it no longer represents justice, and justice is no longer effectuated. I wanted to make this video. Bleak House is one of those novels that I'm not seeing talked a lot about throughout social media, as classics have this renaissance, which I love so much and I think is so important. I'm so glad that people are returning to classics and finding a lot of joy and comfort and critiques of our own time in them. I'm so glad that people are returning to classics and getting a lot out of them. I think Bleak House is one that stands up. I think that you can learn a lot from it. I think there's a lot to see in here. I don't necessarily think it's for everyone, but I think a lot of it is worth thinking about. This video, these were just my thoughts as I was reading what stood out to me. I could be completely wrong. I have not done any research into Dickens, where he was at the time that he was writing this. I do know that Dickens worked as a law clerk. He participated in the legal system. I gather from this novel that he did not like it. I could be wrong, but I get the impression that he didn't much love being an attorney. The British legal system is slightly different than the American legal system in the US. They were derived from the same place, but they do have their differences. My understanding is that Dickens worked as a law clerk and he did not go on to become either what is called a solicitor or a barrister. There's slight differences between the two there. I think the distinction still existed in this time. Present day, I'm not 100% clear on the distinction. I know it still exists. I don't know if it's as clear as it was back in the 1800s. Dickens later turned to writing and became the writer that we know and love, but he got a start in law. And it definitely influenced his writing. It definitely gave him a lot to think about. This is the first of Dickens' major later works that I have read. I'm so curious to get into some of his bigger, more blockbusters. I think I've mentioned I've read some of his less popular works. Those were written before Bleak House. So I'm excited to see if there's anything else written after that touches on the law, discusses that. Again, I'm not the biggest Dickens fan. I like reading him every once in a while. I like analyzing his works. The style isn't completely for me. But if you love Charles Dickens and you have a favorite Dickens, leave in the comments below what I should get to first. I have not read Great Expectations, Hard Times, or A Tale of Two Cities. I have all those. They're in my box set. I have read A Christmas Carol and I really do adore that one. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for letting me analyze this very chunky book, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.